I want to thank you all for your participation in this important event today. Thank you, first of all, to our panelists and the participating missions for your support and engagement in this critically important issue. As many of you know, I am the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. I know deep in my soul where hate and discrimination, intolerance and mistrust can and usually does lead. And I sit before you today as the personal representative of President Biden, speaking for the United States of America with a deep commitment to build trust and to pave a path forward together. We're all here today because we share a deep concern about mounting hate, discrimination, or violence targeting Muslims the world over. We see it online. We see it in efforts to otherize Muslims. And we see it in acts of deliberate provocation intended to intimidate or to silence. Indeed, abhorrent Islamophobic acts led to last year's urgent debate at the HRC and Resolution 53-1. While we did not have the same perspective on some of the aspects of that particular text, what was very clear was that we all share unequivocal condemnation of any act of anti-Muslim hate or violence. We know the harm that hate speech can inflict, and we categorically condemn it in all of its forms. But efforts to counter hatred cannot come at the cost of freedom of expression. This reflects both principle and also pragmatism, because ultimately prohibiting hate speech doesn't work. It fails to address the underlying causes of discrimination and bigotry. Efforts to ban offensive speech often generate more attention and result in further amplification of the very speech that authorities seek to restrict. We have seen how hatred withers in the face of public scrutiny, and if governments try to limit freedom of expression, this only forces hateful ideas to find new venues in which to manifest unchecked. While today's discussion will feature on efforts primarily from within the US, Europe, and OIC countries, we know all too well that hatred and violence against religious and ethnic minorities is a global phenomenon. All countries are faced with this. The US is no exception. In the US, our universities have been grappling with how to support free speech and the ability of individuals to assemble peacefully while protecting their students and their property. Some have chosen to establish and enforce rules around peaceful protests that ensure all students can freely and safely express themselves, regardless of the topic, and this is really important, regardless of the topic, without resulting in violence or in destruction of property. I hope that more will follow suit. Whether or not we agree with or like what people have to say, we must protect their right to say it in a peaceful manner. As events over the last year have reminded us, we all must uphold freedom of expression while protecting minorities in our communities, and we are all striving to do better. That's why we're in the room today. It's why we must share our best practices in discussions like the one we are having today. Fortunately, we have a framework for addressing this hatred, the landmark UN Human Rights Council Resolution 1618, which seeks to address the underlying causes of intolerance, improve education, increase training, improve non-discrimination measures, and ensure accountability for hate crimes. We understand that there is a desire to ensure our approach reflects recent concerns, and we stand ready to work together with all of our partners. You can count on the United States and on me and my team. We will continue to combat the scourge of Islamophobia and other forms of religious hatred, and we call on all governments around the world to uphold their duties and respect the rights of all persons to organize their lives in accordance with their religious beliefs, identity, and conscience. I'm now going to turn it over to Michael Weiner of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to introduce the panelists, and sadly the one that could not make it today, and moderate the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Taylor, and also to the Permanent Mission of the United States for hosting this side event, actually with the participation also of the European Union, of Pakistan, of Turkey, and of the United Kingdom. I think today's side event is really an excellent opportunity for all of us to share government initiatives when it comes to best practices in countering Islamophobia and other forms of intolerance, discrimination, or violence on the basis of religion or belief, but also to really share what works and what doesn't work, and to enhance collaboration in this respect. Let me quote very briefly what the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk, stated publicly on the International Day to Combat Islamophobia, 15th of March this year. He called attention to, I quote, a wave of renewed hate speech, discrimination, and violence in all regions, including against Muslims. And also the Secretary General has recently published the latest in a series of reports on combating intolerance based on religion or belief, which actually will be presented later this month to the General Assembly in New York. He called for ensuring the equal protection of everyone by adopting comprehensive anti-discrimination laws in conformity with international human rights law standards. The Secretary General also noted that further progress in implementing the 1618 Action Plan is needed, including through the Istanbul process and strategic engagement with faith-based actors. And in this context, peer-to-peer learning, something that we are actually actively doing today, and awareness raising may promote respect and understanding between both individuals and communities across religions and beliefs, ultimately upholding the dignity of all. We have a large turnout today at this side event, which I think is also testament to the importance of the topic itself, but also from listening to each other and learning from each other. And we have also a wonderful lineup of panelists, of speakers, who I will be introducing separately just before their respective presentations for 4 minutes each. And in view of the short time, I will immediately go to the first panelist and introduce Ambassador Rashad Hussain. He's the Ambassador at Large of the United States Office of International Religious Freedom. He serves as the principal advisor to the US Secretary of State and advisor to the President on religious freedom conditions and policy. And prior to his appointment in January 2022, he was director at the National Security Council's Partnership and Global Engagement Directorate. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with all of you. Thank you to Ambassador Taylor for hosting us here in Geneva. It really is a distinct privilege and honor to be able to come together with all of you at such an important and historic time, to come together to promote respect and to counter and reject hatred, including religious hatred and dehumanization that we're seeing around the world. I serve in the position of Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, and I just want to take a minute to describe the work that we do around the world. We, as an office with strong bipartisan support, work to protect religious freedom of everyone, everywhere in the world. And we try to be as consistent as we possibly can in this work. And I think it's a very powerful message that the last 3 ambassadors to serve in my role have been a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim, Ambassador Saperstein, then Ambassador Brownback, and myself. And we do this work around the world to protect one of our most cherished principles, the First Amendment in the United States, which prohibits the establishment of any state religion and also guarantees the free exercise of religion. It's undoubtedly the case that we're seeing an unacceptable rise in religious hatred around the world, an avalanche of anti-Semitism, a dangerous spike in Islamophobia as well. And as someone who is a Muslim myself, I want to briefly speak to my personal connection to the work that we're doing right now on Islamophobia, which includes the creation of a national strategy to counter Islamophobia and related forms of hatred, following up on the strategy that we released, the first ever strategy to counter anti-Semitism. From a young age, growing up in a Muslim family, I understand the reverence that is shown to the most holy parts of the faith, including the scripture, including the Holy Quran. I was someone that went through the process of memorization of the Quran myself, and it's something that I still, to this day, have to keep up with on a daily basis, to revise, to make sure that I don't lose my memory, and in cases where I have, to rememorize and to revise. I was taught there is so much respect for the physical text of the Quran that I should never, when I'm walking with it, ever bring it below my waist. And we know from the Islamic tradition that we don't even touch the Quran without being in a state of wudu, without having ablution. So I understand when I see acts of desecration of that same text taking place around the world, I know the sensitivities and the disrespect that is involved and that is perceived by over 1 billion people in the world. At the same time as we come together, I truly believe that all of us in this room sincerely share a commitment to protecting religious freedom, to protecting the respect of sacred religious traditions, and at the same time, protecting the fundamental freedom of expression. And there's no doubt that there are times when it seems that the two are at odds. And different countries might have different understandings, and different countries might draw the line in different places on how to reconcile those two differences, but nonetheless, we all cherish these principles. And I believe our responsibility is to find ways in we can maximize our areas of agreement and to minimize our areas of disagreement where they exist. And I think it's possible to do that. With the 1618 resolution, I was around at the time of the creation of 1618, working with a number of countries and working with many of you here at the Human Rights Council. We came up with a framework that needs to be reinvigorated. And as our challenges around the world have evolved, so must our responses. But all of us are here with the story of what our countries are doing sincerely to address this challenge. And we need to step back, I believe, and remember what we have in common, to rebuild some of the trust that's been lost due to recent events and debates about recent events, and to remember that we truly share this common objective of protecting freedom of religion, for building respect, and for countering hatred. I will say that even my own experience as a Muslim American, I believe it's fundamentally important to do everything that we can to address the underlying causes of hatred and to not take steps that might make it difficult for individuals to express themselves. I will say as a Muslim, as a minority, and I was born in the state of Wyoming, which is the least populous state in the United States. And I grew up in Texas. And part of the reason why Islam is accepted in those types of places is because in America, we have such freedom of expression that there's a level of respect that's built for even beliefs that are different or beliefs that seem foreign. It's that same freedom of expression that allows us to have freedom of religion and for that freedom of religion to thrive. And the last thing I'll say is that I remember in events throughout my own lifetime, when there have been attempts to restrict speech, as Ambassador Taylor has mentioned, that's actually the time when I remember acts that are deemed offensive being even more amplified. So you might think back to the example of Salman Rushdie in the Satanic Verses. You might think back to the examples of the Danish cartoons. So we have a common commitment to doing whatever we can to promote respect and to counter hatred. I think there's some disagreements on the best way to do it, What I'm interested in is what is going to be most effective and what is going to be most true to our principles in the United States, that is protecting freedom of religion and freedom of expression and not prohibiting expression unless it rises to the level of incitement to imminent violence. There are a number of different understandings as to how best to go about achieving these objectives, but I do think that with the framework of the Istanbul process, efforts to increase education and awareness, to increase anti-discrimination measures, to enforce those laws, to enforce hate crimes laws, to really respect and to promote the role of civil society and religious leaders and other religious actors in this work, that we do have a strong framework for addressing many of the challenges that we face today. And it's up to us now to roll up our sleeves and to get in the details and to reinvigorate all those tools that exist. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Ambassador Hussain, also for flagging the importance and the interrelatedness between respect, between freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression, and also for raising these concrete examples of Salman Rushdie's book and the cartoons, which I think can be very instructive. We had hoped, and you may have also seen in the flyer, some of which you may have received beforehand, to have as the next panelist Ambassador Mehmet Pakcharki, who is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Secretary General's Special Envoy on Combating Islamophobia. Unfortunately, he had to cancel his trip to Geneva today, but I also wanted to convey on behalf of the co-sponsors the deep value that is attached to the OIC's role and also to the collaboration on this issue. With that, I will turn over to Marion Lalisse on my right hand. She's the European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Muslim Hatred. You started your post in February 2023. Marion Lalisse served also as Deputy European Union Ambassador to Yemen and also as Chargé d'Affaires ad interim there. And previously, she held also several positions at the EU delegations in Ghana, Mauritania, and Morocco. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Distinguished participants, I'm honored to be with you today to talk about the fight against anti-Muslim hatred in the European Union. Let me thank the United States for organizing this important side event. No country can self-proclaim itself a democracy, the home of human rights, as a shield against criticism and law. There must be an everyday reality check, because no country is immune to hate speech, hate crime. While we know that hatred towards various religious groups exists throughout the world, in my job, I focus on the EU. Tackling anti-Muslim hatred and racism requires, as a first step, to acknowledge that it exists and that it can be ingrained in our own institutions, our own families, our own daily lives. It requires a recognition that even though we cherish freedom of expression, we do not support or allow hate speech or hate crime towards our fellow citizens who may be Muslims or perceived as such. It's also a matter of preventing discrimination that has far-reaching consequences on various areas of life of individuals and our societies. Did you know that racism and anti-Muslim hatred cost money to our economies? Did you know that people earn a living and win elections by spreading hatred here in Europe and elsewhere in the world? Letting such hatred spread can only be the result of short-term calculations, disregarding the individual and collective burden of such phenomenon. For almost a decade, the jobs of coordinators on combating anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred have existed at the European Commission. Conspiracy theories about Muslims and other minorities are legion. They are powerful and represent virtual stains that will never be completely washed away. The European Commission addresses anti-Muslim hatred as part of its 2020 to 2025 EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, which recognizes the structural nature of racism. Anti-Muslim hatred, which is likely underestimated, is still very prevalent in Europe. On top of gender bias and discrimination affecting the entire female population, Muslim women and girls can face an extra burden of hatred, especially if they are visibly Muslim. Our general position remains the same. Muslim women should be free to decide not to wear or to wear a headscarf in Europe and elsewhere in the world. At the end of this month, the report Being Muslim in the EU of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency will be published. After the 7th of October, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred have skyrocketed, as always at times of crisis. These increases is palpable offline and online. Incidents of vandalism targeting mosques, desecration of Muslim cemeteries, spray painted with swastikas, or calls for expelling Muslims, hate crimes against individuals have multiplied in the EU. Nowadays, far-right and violent right-wing extremism do not have the monopoly of anti-Muslim hatred in Europe. We are seeing an anti-Muslim drift in narratives from mainstream politicians and media. In response to the worrying rise in hatred following 7th of October, a joint communication entitled No Place for Hate, A Europe United Against Hatred was published by the European Commission on 6th of December last year, with a particular focus on Jewish and Muslim communities. Part of my role is to coordinate and support efforts of EU member states in the fight against anti-Muslim hatred targeting our EU Muslim fellow citizens. Let me quote some non-exhaustive examples of promising practices. In 2023, Germany released a first-ever report on anti-Muslim sentiment. This 400-page report, mandated by the Ministry of Interior and prepared by an independent group of experts, dissects with precision anti-Muslim hatred. In France, a working group on anti-Muslim acts was put in place within the Forum of French Islam. A practical legal guide was published for combating anti-Muslim crimes. Within the EU, in recent years, action plans on racism, or specifically on anti-Muslim hatred, have been produced at national or local levels. For instance, Sweden, Barcelona, Bologna, and Berlin have dedicated documents on combating anti-Muslim hatred. 21 high-level representatives co-signed with me a joint statement on 29th of November last year, condemning increased level of anti-Muslim hatred following 7th of October. Based on this statement, together with the Council of Europe, we organized a first-ever coordination meeting on combating anti-Muslim hatred that took place in Strasbourg in March 2024 with 31 countries. In May of this year, 13 European equality bodies met in Brussels at my request to discuss anti-Muslim discrimination. Civil society actors form key pieces of our democratic fabric. At a time when we are witnessing an erosion of civic space, it's our collective responsibility to ensure a conducive environment for actors combating anti-Muslim hatred and other forms of racism, as they often become themselves targets and victims. In Europe, as in the rest of the world, human rights deserve our continuous attention. Let me reiterate that the European Union and its member states are fully committed to leading by example in combating anti-Muslim hatred and discrimination today and tomorrow.
Many thanks, Marie-Annelise, for your introspective presentation and also for highlighting the European Union Anti-Racism Action Plan, which recognizes the structural nature of anti-Muslim hatred. With that, we will turn to another regional organization, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ambassador Evren Dardelen Akgün is the personal representative of the OSCE Chair in Office on Combating Intolerance and Discrimination Against Muslims. She served last year also as a member of the steering board for the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, and previously as ambassador of Turkey to the Kingdom of Thailand and also permanent representative to UNESCO in Bangkok. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Is this working? Thank you for the invitation to today's panel and giving me the opportunity to meet all of you here at the home of this important international human rights architecture, which ties us to the OSCE, because the OSCE is the first regional security organization that treated security from also from a human security dimension, based on a firm commitment to human rights and the inherent dignity for all. Within the human dimension, the OSCE has established a robust framework to combat racism, all forms of discrimination, anti-Semitism, and has broadened this framework to cover anti-Muslim issues, intolerance and discrimination against Muslims, acknowledging the growing concerns of Muslim hatred. In implementing these commitments, the OSCE collaborates closely with the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR. Now, ODIHR plays a crucial role in this partnership by leveraging its expertise in monitoring, reporting, and providing policy guidance, as well as engaging in capacity building activities. ODIHR's work, to give you an example, in reporting hate crime data from participating states and civil society ties also in the work undertaken in this council, as combating hate crime, especially based on religion and belief, is an essential element in the successful implementation of Resolution 1618. The intercultural and interreligious dialogue have a meaningful impact in advancing tolerance and non-discrimination, where, of course, we must determine the interlocutors carefully. We must engage those who are genuine and who do not have a hidden agenda. This also ties in with the implementation of Resolution 1618, and there are many good examples of good practices in this area in the OSCE, where the countries have done notable work led by civil society, some sponsored by the states, both nationally and at the local level. ODIHR's active engagement with relevant stakeholders, for example, putting in place training programs for prosecutors and law enforcement, among others, has been instrumental in this respect as well. And I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that as we speak here right now, there is the Warsaw Human Dimension Conference going on in Warsaw, where these issues are also going to be being taken up, and especially next week there will be a live stream, there will be a side event. So I would like to let you know that you could also watch those events. So, dear participants, how come after years of producing reports, making declarations, taking decisions, and despite all efforts to promote and protect human rights, countries in Europe and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, we are still experiencing growing waves of bias, exclusion, hate crimes, and racist violence against Muslims? Hardly a day goes by without some form of hate crime, harassment, desecration of places of worship, cemeteries, or holy symbols taking place. Otherization and ostracization in public life are also rampant. Such marginalization may feed into de-individuation, which can easily be abused or used by criminals to recruit outliers. Furthermore, public burnings of the Quran are often coupled with anti-Muslim and racist anti-migrant rhetoric. Between January 23 and March of this year, 600 occasions in Europe were encountered where the Quran was burned. These clear acts of hatred constitute a blatant affront to all Muslims. Let us not fool ourselves, dear participants. The objective of the burning of the Quran is to provoke, agitate, hurt, and make Muslims feel that they are not welcome. These are also a test of how our democracies fare in the face of such atrocities. This issue has just been touched upon by my colleagues. While freedom of expression is one cornerstone of democracy, one can rightly conclude that those who perpetrate these acts actually abuse this vital fundamental right for spreading hatred. At the international level, HRC Resolution 53.1 calls for a greater emphasis on this issue, and however, individual state responses have been varied. We must not forget that such acts only serve to perpetuate a culture of intolerance and even hatred towards Muslims. They instill a sense of fear and insecurity within our communities and actually harm the fabric of our societies. Far-right organizations in Europe are gaining popularity. We have also seen this just this Sunday. These can no longer be considered fringe movements. The anti-Muslim narrative of these political tendencies, let's say, portray Islam as a threat to Western civilization, incompatible with Western values. A rise in such rhetoric through online sources further shows us the speed with which hateful prejudices and biases get disseminated. Algorithms employed by major social media platforms can inadvertently perpetuate biases, leading to targeted victimization of specific communities, including Muslims. When members of a society replace patterns of connection with one another by patterns of so-called self-preservation or exclusion in a fear-based narrative, societal discrimination against those considered the other takes root. In this grim picture, it is Muslim women who most find themselves at the center of multiple forms of discrimination and attacks. Indeed, the issue of intersecting discrimination faced by Muslim women is a critical issue of concern, commonly known as gendered Islamophobia. In conclusion, there are many elements contributing to anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia today. These cover a complex thicket of reasons ranging from economics to politics, from historical to domestic politics, or unresolved political issues leading to the atrocities we witness in the Middle East today. None justifies the racist and xenophobic rhetoric and attitudes which fuel polarization and hatred. Anti-Muslim hatred is a multifaceted issue which needs to be tackled with targeted, concrete measures and action. Now, we must all understand that Muslims are not the folk devil that some try to portray them as. This moral panic regarding Muslims and Islam must be overcome. Yes, we are tribal beings, but the days of seeking safety within our small enclaves are long gone. To let ourselves be guided by such biases is indeed pathetic. Political maneuvering through this issue is also unacceptable. Instead, a new social contract with a large societal base is desirable, perhaps long overdue. Engaging the youth is vital in this respect. With the political climate in an increasing number of OSCE countries slipping towards far-right tendencies, the risk for institutionalizing anti-Muslim policies is growing. Anti-Muslim hatred and fear of Islam must not be allowed to turn into a human rights crisis. We need to return to a baseline of human dignity for all. International understanding, collaboration, and cooperation, the right political choices, and civic action are vital to taking timely steps to prevent this from happening. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ambassador Dagdalena Akgün, also for raising the gendered perspective, the specific impact of Islamophobia on women and girls, and also for raising the incidents of Quran burnings, and also for your call for a new social contract. Actually, almost a year ago, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk, at the Human Rights Council session on the 5th of October 2023, already also called for a new social contract in that context. So I think there we have some ideas to discuss. With that, I will turn now to Ulrika Sundberg, who is Sweden's Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and for Intercultural and Interfaith Dialogue. And before taking up the post as Special Envoy, she served as Ambassador of Sweden to Ireland, to Belgium, and to Pakistan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And I, like others, want to start off by thanking the U.S. mission and in particular Ambassador Taylor for convening this timely event. I'm really happy to see so many colleagues and experts on this panel. And I know that we all share the same goal and vision, namely to foster global unity in the fight against religious intolerance, discrimination, and hate crimes. This is also an excellent opportunity to take stock of all the efforts undertaken, both internationally and nationally, to prevent and counter racism, discrimination, intolerance, and to engage in a constructive dialogue on how we can enhance their effectiveness. Since it was mentioned by Ivren, I will start off by, of course, saying that last year we witnessed in several countries, including my own, offensive and disrespectful desecrations of scriptures or holy books. These provocative acts were carried out by individuals who sought to stir up tensions and to sow splits within our societies and between nations. And we fully understand that Muslims around the world were deeply offended by these provocative acts. The Swedish government has been firm and consistently speaking out and strongly rejecting any acts of intolerance. These despicable acts committed by individuals in no way reflect the opinion of the Swedish government nor of the majority of the Swedish people. Last October, we had a visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, which was very constructive and engaged us in an enlightening dialogue. The Special Rapporteur concluded that Sweden had acted in conformity with its international human rights obligations, that burning the Quran under certain circumstances can amount to advocacy of religious hatred that constitute incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Since then, one person in Sweden has been convicted for incitement to hatred for burning the Quran, a conviction that was upheld upon appeal and has sent a strong signal of deterrence to the society. Currently, we have 4 cases of Quran burnings pending before the Swedish courts, and we are, of course, awaiting their adjudication. In addition, we had an inquiry to review the Swedish Public Order Act appointed by the government, and it recently submitted its report. The government welcomes this report as it contains proposals that aim to strengthen the protection of Sweden's security while protecting the rights enshrined in the Swedish constitution, namely freedom of assembly, freedom to demonstrate, freedom of expression, and of course freedom of religion or belief. Sweden has over the years received a considerable number of Muslims, both Sunni and Shias, as well as persecuted Christian minorities from different conflicts, notably in the Middle East and in Asia. We have strived to integrate all newcomers and their children into our society based on their equal rights and worth. In 2016, the Swedish government adopted a national plan to combat all forms of racism, similar forms of hostility and hate crime. This plan is a preventive tool by the government to combat racism and polarization in the society. The plan was complemented by several action programs in 2022, notably on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, Afrophobia, and of course the rights of our indigenous people, the Samis. The action program on Islamophobia has 4 strategic areas: more knowledge and education and research, strengthening preventive resources online, a more active legal system, which we saw the results of with the conviction of one person for the Quran burnings, greater support to civil society and more in-depth dialogue with civil society, and lastly, improved coordination and monitoring. Now, we are moving to the next phase, and we have had these action programs evaluated by our state authority and who has said that we need to set more clear goals, and we need to work more in a more coordinated and comprehensive manner. Moving forward, we need to create the conditions for the work to be more accurate, more effective, evaluable, and long-term. The focus is now on creating a structure for the national work against racism and hate crimes that can contribute also to the work done at the local and regional level, and pass on the knowledge and tools developed to reach and be used within the municipal and regional operations. Another important direction of the new action plan is the implementation that the work needs to be done collectively and comprehensively against racism and hate crimes, while it focuses especially on different forms of racism in order to capture the vulnerability of the different groups. Dialogues with civil society are important to identify the challenges, the new challenges, and the need for measures, as well as for the follow-up. We are currently working on a comprehensive whole-of-government action plan to prevent and combat all forms of racism and intolerance. And the idea is to strengthen ongoing efforts. Many sectors are in focus, like education and social media, but this new action plan will lay the foundation for a broad, coherent, and unified work against racism, hate crimes, and notably Islamophobia. At the same time, the Swedish government has also increased its dialogue with Muslim countries and partner organizations like the EU, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, ODIHR, OIC, the Alliance of Civilizations, as well as faith communities. We believe that the polarized situation that we are currently living after 7th of October calls for more dialogue, not less, to promote mutual understanding, respect, and tolerance. Thank you.
Many thanks, Special Envoy, for sharing the experiences from Sweden and also providing an update on the cases that have been decided or are still pending before the courts. In view of the time, I immediately hand over to Ahmed Shahid, who is a professor of international human rights law at the University of Essex, and many of us actually know him due to his previous role as Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief at the United Nations, and that was until 2022. And he is still currently a member of the ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Distinguished participants, as a campaigner against all forms of hate and exclusion, I am grateful to the organizers for inviting me to join this very constructive dialogue today. The flyer for today's event highlighted 3 key points: trends in Islamophobia, good practice in challenging different forms of hate, and collaboration against religious intolerance. On trends, the key point I wish to stress is the need to invest more in gathering data, especially empowering society actors to document and report. The reporting gap is quite concerning. On good practice, in relation to some forms of hate, a few countries have adopted relevant legal and policy frameworks, as we heard just now as well, established dedicated institutional mechanisms, allocated sufficient resources, and engaged constructively with affected communities. Thus, a comprehensive and transparent national action plan, a well-supported national coordinator to oversee the action plan, investment in society capacity building, and consultation with affected communities to evaluate results appear to be the best model. These good practice examples track well with the 4-step model proposed by the OHCHR in 2011 to operationalize human rights obligations of states. Step 1 of this model, however, requires the identification of the attributes of the phenomenon. In the case of Islamophobia, this often proves to be a difficult step. However, the working definition of Islamophobia offered by the UN Secretariat to commemorate the International Day to Combat Islamophobia, when used alongside the Rabat Action Plan, may offer a constructive way to apply the conceptual framework proposed by the OHCHR to operationalize state commitments. There may also be nationally relevant other definitions, since it is context that can make hate speech truly dangerous speech. Perhaps the best template for effective action to prevent and combat Islamophobia and all forms of bigotry, and what meets the third goal of this meeting, is Action Plan in HRC Resolution 1618. The architects of the resolution developed the Istanbul process to follow up in its implementation. While enthusiasm for the Istanbul process appears to have ebbed and flowed, 2 lessons stand out. First, that it continues to provide a practical and useful global framework to counter Islamophobia and other forms of hatred. Second, as shown in the plenaries in Singapore and in The Hague, the most productive meetings have been multi-stakeholder, government and society actors. Multi-stakeholder meetings do better in sharing good practice, supporting networking and coalition building, sorting out upstanders and bystanders, identifying gaps and ways to address them. It is also the best way to address hate in the digital age. Since human rights are about duties owed by governments to their people, Muslim voices need to be networked and amplified to ensure states implement commitments in the 1618 resolution. HR 1618 also calls for self-reporting by states. Since reporting is dismally low, an alternative may be to engage in regional consultations to identify gaps and good practices to promote shared learning, increase transparency, and better inform policymakers and our meetings here in Geneva. I'd like to conclude by thanking and commending the government of Albania as it was already announced earlier this year, for agreeing to co-host with Essex University a conference in Tirana to foster a global multi-stakeholder coalition against all forms of hate and to launch a standing forum of human rights elders. As a key driver of this initiative, I am keen that the conference serves to energize, among other things, implementing HR 16, Resolution 1618. This will be the first multi-stakeholder conference since 2017 January, where Islamophobia will be addressed as a major focus. On that occasion, 8 years ago, the US, OIC, and the EU co-convened a major conference in New York to combat Islamophobia and offered a good audit of what was working and what was not, and ensured the value of multi-stakeholder model and promoted coalition building and networking. I look forward to seeing you all, upstanders here, at the conference in Tirana later this year. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Ahmed Shahid, for already your work as a special rapporteur, including the report focusing on countering Islamophobia 3 years ago to the Human Rights Council, and also for flagging the forthcoming Tirana conference. And I'm sure people who are interested can approach you after the event in case they may have any questions. With this, I would like to turn to also the other states who are participating and who were instrumental in putting this side event together. First, I would turn to the United Kingdom, to the Human Rights Ambassador Eleanor Sanders. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our very, very expert panelists. I would say we've heard loud and clear here today, and I think we can say we all agree that all forms of religious hatred or intolerance and racism are utterly unacceptable. We've heard a lot about these challenges, but I think we've also heard a lot of positive examples of responses to these challenges. So thank you to all of our contributors for sharing those. We've heard a reasonable amount today about states' domestic experiences, and in that vein, I will share a little bit about ours in the UK. Sadly, we too have seen Muslim communities and other minorities targeted, including very recently over this summer in the UK. The government has been clear that these recent incidents of far-right thuggery and racist rhetoric will not be tolerated, and any such violence will be met with a firm judicial response. Some of the things we've done to respond to these challenges have been to put in place support mechanisms for those affected by these incidents, such as access to mental health and psychological services, and communication with affected communities. We have a protective security for mosques scheme, which provides physical protective security measures in both mosques and associated Muslim faith community centres. We're also committed to supporting programmes which monitor and support victims of Islamophobia. We funded a programme called Tell Mama, which some of you may have heard of, a service which supports victims of anti-Muslim hatred and has been recognised internationally as a good practice model in recording and monitoring anti-Muslim hate. At the same time, we want to create a context in which there are no examples of religious intolerance going forward, and so we're looking at new ways all the time to help bolster community cohesion and resilience, including by setting up events and activities to help create long-lasting support networks involving schools, businesses, faith groups, sports clubs, and other such partners at local levels. We also explain civic rights and duties to challenge and build resilience against extremism and hate crime. Finally, I want to underline the extent to which we agree that the global increase recently in Islamophobia and other religious intolerance has to be addressed urgently. We believe that Resolution 16/18 was a significant achievement, and it's through this consensus-based resolution and its clearly defined action plan that we will be able to do this, and we must do this going forward. We as the UK stand ready with our partners and friends to fully reinvigorate the Istanbul process that we've touched on a little bit to counter rising intolerance. We believe it's only through this mutual understanding and trust that we can work collectively together to combat religious intolerance. Thank you.
Many thanks. And without further ado, I would hand the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan, Saman Mehdi. Over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Ambassador Taylor, Ambassador Rashad Hussain, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by appreciating the US mission for hosting this event on an issue of growing salience. May I also welcome Ambassador Rashad Hussain to Geneva and thank all the panelists for their remarks. Expressions of hatred based on religion and manifestations of religious intolerance are on the rise across the world. Growing expressions of hate based on religion present a common challenge. The escalation in this trend in recent years has some common strands. These include populism, mass and rapid disinformation, and from our perspective, inadequate understanding, tools, and capacity for early warning and crisis prevention. If we believe that the trend is growing, and there is abundant data to support that, and a clear consensus amongst our panelists, then our work must begin by addressing the gaps that are normative, in policy, and critically in our partnerships. Second, we may try to see the matter from the perspective of those affected by advocacy of hate, and not only think how they should perceive the advocacy of hate. This will bring us closer to the solutions. Third, we could consider how to expand spaces for protections. This may require challenging the narratives of hate provocateurs and critically employing those policy toolkits that enable protection spaces for target communities and reduce spaces for hate actors. Limitations and prohibitions enshrined in the human rights law are meant to secure rights and freedoms. The international law does not envisage use of rights, even if it's free speech or the right to self-defense, for destruction of dignity and lives of other people. Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred are indeed of growing international concern. The UN Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Special Procedure Mandate holders have spoken about it. We recognize that key capitals, international and regional organizations are appointing special envoys to work on this critical area. Some governments have given consideration to developing national strategies and action plans. Some have already taken concrete actions in the follow-up of the incidents of attacks of Holy Quran, and we hope that others may follow. Several resolutions of the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council point us in the direction of taking action on a set of preventive and affirmative measures. Ladies and gentlemen, hate against one group is inseparable from hate against all. Once weaponized, hate will keep searching for new targets. Combating Islamophobia, therefore, should be an area of international collaboration for building a world where people of all faiths can live without fear. To borrow a word from US President Biden's statement on International Day to Combat Islamophobia, we only have to rededicate ourselves to it. The word is rededicate. Thank you.
Many thanks, Pakistan, for your intervention. I would now turn the floor to the permanent delegation of the European Union, Friederike Ciampa, who is the head of the Human Rights section. You have the floor.
Thank you. And many thanks, Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Hussain, for spearheading such an important and timely event, and to all panelists for their insightful presentations. As we have heard from several speakers today, hate speech is indeed a complex and multidimensional phenomenon. Hatred can manifest itself in many forms: harassment, insults, disinformation, threats, and all the way to violence proper. We all know this leads to dangerous divisions in society as a whole. We heard the targets of hate speech become increasingly excluded from society, forced out of public debate, and ultimately silenced. For these reasons, hate speech is forbidden by law in the European Union. We have a solid criminal law framework that is being monitored by the judiciary. That said, in parallel, we must also invest in building more inclusive societies. Criminalization as such, laws alone, are not sufficient, as we all know. Tolerance, intercultural and interreligious understanding must be nurtured, ideally from a very young age onwards. No one is born hating, as Nelson Mandela used to say. You learn to hate. That means you can also unlearn to hate. Dear members of the panel, what can the international community do more to encourage more interaction, more cooperation, more progress on this important issue? Thank you so much.
Many thanks, European Union. And with that, I would like to turn the floor to the permanent mission of Turkey, Muzaffer Uyan Gültekin. You have the floor.
Thank you, Michael. We also observe with grave concern the dangerous rise of Islamophobia and clear manifestations of anti-Muslim hatred. We have to recognize that this is a human rights problem. That is why we thank the panelists for their insight on the ways to tackle this issue. We have to look at the root causes and drivers. There we see that politics, deliberate political choices, and far-right rhetoric that otherize, that divide, play a key role. The rise in tolerance and hatred correlates closely with such politics. Therefore, combating Islamophobia and religious hatred requires political will, first and foremost. And of course, at the entire background lies deeply entrenched systemic racism. It is not acceptable to normalize any type of hatred and racism under any pretext. Standing up to attacks on the underlying values of human rights conventions, particularly tolerance, social peace, respect for equal dignity, and non-discrimination, is crucial for us all. No particular right is above another right, nor can any right be employed for ends to attack underlying fundamental values of peace, tolerance, respect for equal dignity, or to promote or justify hatred, violence against entire groups, to dehumanize, target, reject, or exclude a group of people, or to violate the rights of other rights, including freedom of religion. Some of the panelists picked on intersecting factors when it comes to tackling this issue, from origin, ethnicity, color, sex, immigration status. As a woman, I also wish to underline that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred disproportionately impacts Muslim women. It is also a similar case in the context of employment. History demonstrates sowing seeds of hatred is a threat to all humanity. That is why we need to stand up against it together. Turkey remains committed to combating Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. We are ready to work together to build a world of equal dignity, justice, and peace for all, and peaceful coexistence of all religions. If I may, I just have a quick question for the EU coordinator. She had quite an introspective approach. What further concrete action EU is planning to do to stand up against this rising tide of anti-Muslim hatred in the EU? Thank you.
Many thanks, Turkey. We also wanted to give the floor to civil society, and we have here with us Jehan Pereira, who is the Executive Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka. You have the floor.
Well, I represent a civil society organization in Sri Lanka, which is supported by the US State Department, and I'm grateful that I have received this opportunity to be present here. I will speak from my experience of Sri Lanka, which I know best, and there's also a saying we have that civil society shows at the micro level what is applicable at the macro level. So I believe that what I speak about from Sri Lanka might have a larger significance. Sri Lanka is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. Our people essentially, by and large, live peacefully together. They coexist, but they have their own prejudices and mistrusts, and there are conflicts between them. There is violence, local level violence, but that is something that our courts and our police can handle if they are allowed to operate as they should. But we have also had very large-scale violence, where thousands have died, where tens of thousands have died. And where this very large-scale violence is concerned, we see the role of the political parties, political leaders, and the government, our governments themselves, behind this. When government is behind, it is often for political gain, for political advantage. Politicians use the divisions in our society. They blow it up, they create fear, they create hatred, and then they provoke riots. We have found that wherever there are riots, There is a political hand behind it. And when the political hand is there, especially if it's from the government side, the police and the law and order don't function properly. We also have experienced something else, where the country, the government, sometimes to restore order, to win a war, we had a war, a civil war, then some lives become more important than other lives. And then tens of thousands have died. So what I would like to say that from the point of view of civil society, we uphold the international conventions which the UN stands for, human rights. We take them to the people. We talk about the importance of pluralism, of space for others, of tolerance. But what we also ask the international community is to monitor our governments, monitor our countries, so that they abide by those values that the UN stands for. And I also ask that the integrity of the international institutions should be maintained, should be upheld, so that the credibility of the system of human rights is ensured in this world. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jehan, for this civil society perspective and really providing your experiences from the grassroots. Thanks for these interventions. And since we are already beyond our 60 minutes, I would like to thank and hand over immediately to Ambassador Taylor.
Thank you. Thanks again to all the panelists, to the participating states, and to all of you for being here. I think that it really speaks to the importance of this issue around the globe, but particularly here in Geneva, to see this group. I want to end maybe on a little bit of a positive note. I think, like Ambassador Hussain, it's impossible for me to separate my own religious upbringing and beliefs from my work. But, I know that it's because of that I have this dedication to living the tenet of love thy neighbor. And I just wanted to give a few examples of where we've sort of seen that idea playing out. We've seen UK faith leaders who condemn anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant violence following the riots in Southport and across the UK. Interfaith volunteers who publicly pledged to guard Hindu temples and Ahmadi mosques amid civil unrest in Bangladesh. The work of the National Peace Council in Sri Lanka, whose executive director we heard from today, and rabbis in Canada expressing solidarity with an imam whose mosque was attacked in Toronto. These inspiring acts are reminders of our shared humanity and also the ways that we really can come together to combat Islamophobia, to combat all other forms of hate. So I invite all of us to continue this conversation, to continue to build trust among one another, because at the end of the day, if we are not working together, we cannot make progress on this issue. Thank you all so very much for being here. And I'd like to invite the missions that were the co-participants to please join us on the podium for a quick photograph before you leave, if you can. Thank you.